Recording in progress.
Okay, so tonight or this evening, I'm going to be introducing the subject of the first patriarch of Zen, Bodhidharma. And the reason for doing that tonight is because in the next week or so, there's going to be a short course appearing in the Dharma Centre, a 2-module course on the life and teachings of Bodhidharma. Which will be going up. And I thought this evening it might be quite nice just to go through an introduction and perhaps just cover what is the most famous aphorism or verse that is connected with Bodhidharma, which is a 4-line verse that goes as follows. A special transmission outside the teachings, not dependent on words and phrases, directly pointing to the human heart, seeing into its nature, and awakening to it. The first thing to say is that it's almost certain that this verse actually has nothing to do with Bodhidharma whatsoever. Bodhidharma lived round about the 5th century, or 5th and early 6th century AD in China, and the verse itself really didn't appear until the Song dynasty, which was sort of after the Tang dynasty, so sometime in the 10th, 11th century, something like that. However, it was attributed to Bodhidharma, possibly for the very simple reason that these 4 lines were thought ideally to sum up his teaching. If we remember that Bodhidharma in the lineage, he is the 28th Indian patriarch and the first Chinese patriarch, and also called the first Zen patriarch as well. If you see pictures of him, and you'll see plenty of pictures of him on the course, he's bearded, he's got hair, he's got a big earring in his ear. He wears his monk's robes very loosely, showing his sort of chest, as if he's sort of been somewhat dragged through a hedge backwards, we could say. And this is very different. He seems to be flaunting all the rules of the monk. The monk is supposed to be clean shaven, both on the face and on the head, and no jewellery is permitted at all. And obviously the robes should be done up for decency and that sort of thing. And yet here he is looking quite a sight. And this is very deliberate. And in one way, it works very well. In another way, it can attract all kinds of the sort of wrong associations with iconoclasm and so forth, because Bodhidharma represents the spirit of Zen. Perhaps just going back to what we know of the history, and that is not very much. There are 2 early sources for Bodhidharma. Both of them contradict each other in some aspects. One says that he's a prince from South India. The other that he was a prince or nobleman from somewhere in the Persian Empire. However, they do say that he was the successor to the 27th patriarch, who was called Hanyatara in the Japanese chanting of the lineage. And Hanyatara lived at a time of persecution of Buddhism in India. And Bodhidharma was his pupil, and Hanyatara was arrested and sentenced to be executed, which he eventually was, but not before passing on the transmission of the Buddha's robe and bowl to Bodhidharma, who then left India and travelled northeast to China. The story goes that he then crossed the Yangtze River on a piece of grass, and then settled himself at a place called Shaolin. Yes, the famous Shaolin, connected with Kung Fu, and settled into a cave facing the wall, famously sitting Zazen for 9 years. During that time, there are various stories associated. He was summoned to see the Emperor of China, who was a Buddhist as well, answered 3 questions from him, and then recrossed the river and sat in the cave, where later the second patriarch to be, Hui Kei is his Chinese name, Eka is the name used in Japanese, came and questioned him, and after a certain sort of dialogue between them, he also eventually became the successor as well. the Bodhidharma did have a number, or according to the story, according to tradition, did have a number of pupils as well, but the successor was Huike. And we are in that lineage too. And that verse, as I say, was attributed to him sometime after, but as I say, it has always been considered to sort of encapsulate the spirit of Zen. So we'll just spend the rest of the time just going through that and having a look at what that spirit is. So it begins by saying a special transmission outside the teaching. So this transmission, what's known as the transmission of the lamp, this is not only the name of a couple of famous books in the Zen lineage, but is also a metaphor that was used by the Buddha, where the Buddha talked of a lamp that is able to light 1,000 other lamps without diminishing its own flame at all. And this is giving the flavour of the transmission of the Dharma, that the Dharma itself is an active principle, and that a person who's realised the Dharma affects those who come into contact with it. It, as it were, ignites the flame of the Dharma within the beings who are encountered, and this is how the Dharma spreads sort of outward in this way. And this transmission has always been something that's been considered sort of face to face. If you're familiar with the stories of the Zen masters, you'll know that there will be some kind of encounter, and then there will be a moment of awakening, and then the master will in some cases give the transmission to that person, and that transmission gives the authority not only to teach but also to found a monastery, for example, and there are many examples of that. Obaku to Rinzai is the first one that sort of springs to mind. But that transmission originally, according to the sort of Zen tradition, goes back to an earlier time when the Buddha, towards the end of his own life, gave what was called the flower sermon. This was when he sat down in a vast audience who waited eagerly to hear his sermon, and instead of speaking, he reached down, plucked a flower, held it up and just twirled it. And everybody looked rather perplexed and confused, except for Mahakasyapa. And Mahakasyapa smiled, and the Buddha saw this smile and also smiled, and said that he was passing the eye of the transmission to Mahakasyapa, that Mahakasyapa had understood the sermon that the Buddha had just given, where no one else actually had. And this example of the transmission became the core for the understanding in the Zen school for what that transmission should be. And this connects now with the second line, a special transmission outside the teachings, not dependent on words and phrases. So usually when people, for example, gain some kind of high status or some kind of leadership position, it's because they've studied very hard, they'll have practiced, but they'll have studied very hard as well, and they will be very knowledgeable about whatever the subject is. But Zen sort of went in a different direction, and we have to remember that Zen was one of 4 schools that arose in China. The others were the Huayan, we have the Chan, or the Zen school, we have the Tendai school, and also the Pure Land school as well. We don't have to worry too much about the details of that, but suffice to say that there was a lot of philosophizing. When Buddhism moved through to China, it became something of a plaything for the elites, really. The nobles would dress in monks' clothes, they would shave their head, they would build a temple in their back gardens, and they would invite their friends round for tea to discuss high Mahayana philosophy, for example. And it became, and although it might sound somewhat superficial, people were genuinely trying to understand the Dharma. And even when the monasteries were founded as well, there was still a great interest in this very complex Indian Mahayana philosophy. And although, Bodhidharma was never critical of it, the Zen school was never critical of this, it did warn that the most important thing was genuine insight, that reliance on the written word alone was simply not sufficient. So hence why not dependent on words and phrases. But that term not dependent on words and phrases is important. It wasn't a rejection of them, and the Zen school doesn't reject them. The other thing to be said is that many of the other Buddhist schools at that time, and even now, often favoured one particular sutra. So the Lotus Sutra, perhaps, or the Diamond Sutra, or one of the many other. I mean, Mahayana has a huge plethora, a huge body of texts, and different schools would favour one particular text above all others. And the Zen school again rejected that approach, which was not to say it rejected the sutras. In fact, what it said was that you could use any sutra, you could use any, and a teacher could use whatever they deemed necessary, because the most important thing was to try and bring their students, their devotees, to their own genuine insight, and whatever was necessary for that, so be it. And interestingly enough, I remember when I first joined the Zen group in London under Venerable Myokyoni, we were encouraged first of all to attend the sort of fundamentals of Buddhism class, which was just a series of 7 lectures that covered the Four Noble Truths and those sorts and the basic teachings. But then after that, we were told not to read anything, not to read lots of Buddhism books. And then after we'd done some practice for a couple of years, we were asked to go on another course which covered more in depth those fundamental teachings, and then another year later to attend another course on Mahayana. And it was a program that really designed to allow us to accumulate practical experience and not to become too dependent on knowledge. And in fact, Venerable Myokyoni was actually a little bit against whenever we were writing articles using Sanskrit or Chinese or Japanese terms. She preferred us to use English terms, obviously accurately translating. We sometimes were allowed to put the actual original terms in parentheses afterwards, just for clarity. But certainly when we gave talks, she didn't like us using lots of words that would not be understood by the audience. So this again goes back to the Buddha. Shortly before his own death, his monks, who were obviously trying to do the right thing, said to the Buddha, well, how should we preserve your words in Pali or Sanskrit, which were the 2 sacred languages that at the time all texts would be written in one or the other? And the Buddha says, whatever. And he said, in fact, write it in the vernacular, write it in dialect, it doesn't matter. The most important thing is that your audience understands, and the most important thing is that your teaching and the audience should match with each other. That's the most important thing. He wasn't standing on a sort of formal, this is how it's always been done, and therefore, we will do the same. The most important thing was that people should understand, should be able to put it into practice, and then should arrive at their own genuine insight, which was the same insight that, of course, that the Buddha had under the Bodhi tree as well. So a special transmission outside the teachings, not dependent on words and phrases. The downside of that is when it came west, of course, this verse was grasped on. And don't forget, Zen became very popular in the 50s and 60s. And this was, obviously a time of the beat poets in America, and also in the UK as well, and across Europe. 60s, of course, a time of great revolution in many ways as well. There was an overturning of an old tradition. And of course, coming across something that seems quite iconoclastic, or a line that seems quite iconoclastic, did mean that a lot of people thought they could just sort of ditch the teachings. But as I hopefully have made it clear, that's not in fact what Bodhidharma was, or whoever it was that wrote this verse, it's not what they were claiming. Just that we shouldn't exchange learnt knowledge for genuine insight. And genuine insight, the difference between knowledge and insight is that knowledge is information, data if you like, but wisdom, insight, wisdom is the ability to see a situation clearly. And remember, in Buddhism, that means that the kleshas, the fires, have been gentled, because the fires tend to narrow the view, whereas in their absence, the consciousness can open up and it can reflect. This is why the heart is often likened to a mirror. that reflects things as they really are, without any prejudice, without any bias, just plain straightforwardly. And Zen has always prized that straightforwardness. So then we have the third and fourth line, directly pointing to the human heart, seeing into its nature and awakening. So that directly pointing to the human heart. Again, this is actually evoking one of the very important teachings that certainly appeared in the early Buddhism, but Mahayana made a lot of, which is the teaching of the two truths. And the teaching of the two truths, basically, is to sort of sum it up, says that there are two truths. There's an absolute truth, which the Buddha saw at his moment of awakening under the Bodhi tree, when he looked up on the morning of the 8th day and saw the morning star in that clear sky. When he awoke and became the Buddha, he saw what was called the Buddha nature, the nature of things as they really are in himself and in all beings. But then there is also a relative truth. And the absolute truth and the relative truth are not two separate truths. So they're considered like sort of palm and back of hand. They're one thing, but they are distinct from each other. So the relative truth points to the absolute truth. And if we remember the story of the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, we know that after his awakening, he didn't just jump up and start teaching, because he didn't know what he was going to teach. What he had seen was ineffable. What he had seen was beyond words, beyond concepts. It was a luminous mystery, we could describe it as. And so how do you teach a mystery? You can't. That's the whole point. And then the story goes that after some deep pondering, the great god Brahma came down and exhorted the Buddha to teach those whose eyes were little covered with dust the way to the same insight. And so the Buddha conceived the great heart of compassion and got up, began his teaching career. But already in that story, we have this suggestion that there is this absolute truth that cannot be put into words, that can only be seen into, and then there's the relative truth that points at it. And of course, as the famous Zen phrase likes to put it, do not mistake the pointing finger for the moon. So the pointing finger points to the moon. The moon, by the way, in Buddhist iconography represents the heart Buddha, that reflected that heart mirror, because the moon obviously behaves like a mirror. It reflects the sun's rays at night, that's the pointing finger points to the moon. But we don't mistake the finger itself to be the truth, to be the absolute truth. It's merely pointing. So there's a lot of play made on this, certainly in the teachings as well. I mean, for example, in some of the encounters with the Zen masters, the famous master Joshu, for example, was once approached by a monk who asked, "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" Well, the Buddha taught, obviously, that all beings have the Buddha nature. This is in the Nirvana Sutra. How wonderful, how miraculous, all beings are fully endowed with the wisdom and the power of the Buddha nature. And yet the monk comes along, and perhaps he was trying to seek to have his view affirmed by the great master. And Joshu turns around and says no, which seems to contradict everything the Buddha said. But yet Master Joshu couldn't be lying, because he is a bodhisattva, and he's also a master as well. And he wouldn't be lying, because obviously that goes against the precepts. So he must be telling the truth. And yet the Buddha said all beings have it. And at another time, another monk comes along and said, "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" And Master Joshu said yes, which was in alignment with the Buddha's teaching. So what is happening? Does he know? Does he not know? Is he messing around? No, he's not. What he's doing is he's responding, keeping in mind what the Buddha said about the teaching has to match the questioner, has to match the audience. The master is replying in terms that, as it were, just hopefully provide that the necessary crack to, as it were, open the egg of awakening in that person. That's the function of the master, to do that, to find that. So that directly pointing to the human heart, obviously, is what the teacher does. And the teacher, in many ways, certainly the Zen teacher, has a very unique role. The teacher, him or herself, isn't teaching in the usual way. As I say, what the teacher is doing is, as it were, pushing the student into to a place where that awakening can take place. And I remember perhaps the best example of how to articulate that was Soka Morinaga Roshi, who was the head monk at the time when Venerable Myokyeni was training in Daitokuji in Kyoto. And he said that when a monk comes to him, or when a student, Zen student, comes to him for teaching, the first thing he tries to find out is if that student has a problem. If that student doesn't have a problem, then as quickly as he can, he gives the student a problem. And then after that, it's just a matter of making that problem worse and worse and worse until the student has no option but to drop it. And once that problem has been dropped, then the work is done and the student can go away because they've learned to let go. And on that letting go, then the heart opens and the truth can be seen. So it gives that idea a little bit, as I say, that directly pointing to the human heart can come in many different forms. And then the last line, seeing into its nature and awakening, really just brings us back to the most important thing in the Zen school, which is not being dependent on another's insight, but actually awakening to one's own genuine insight. And even in the Dhammapada, again, people often think, oh, Zen sort of, strove its own way apart from the other, Buddhist schools and so forth. But this could not be further from the truth. Even in the Dhammapada, which is the oldest collection of the sayings of the Buddha in Pali, it says, he who reads much of the Dharma, or much of the teachings, much of the Dharma, but practices little, is like one who counts another's cattle. Which I think is very lovely. Such a one can count another person's cattle, but they will never be his. And if the cattle represent the insight, then one can quote Master Rinzai and quote Bodhidharma and quote Master Joshu till the cows come home. But actually, those insights will never be his own unless he truly penetrates those words and has his or her own particular insight. Okay, we'll leave it there. It's time, in fact, just a little bit over, so apologies for that. So just wish everybody well. Welcome back. See you all again next week, and in the meantime, have a good weekend. Thank you.